I want to share one of those real creepy neighbor stories that still makes me check my windows at night, still makes me pull my curtains tight even though I live 3 states away now. This happened late last year when I moved into a rental house in suburban Ohio, and what started as strange gardening habits turned into something I can barely explain without my hands starting to shake. The neighbor's name was Mr. Henshaw. He lived in the Tudor-style house directly across from mine, the kind of place that looked charming in daylight but seemed to absorb shadows after sunset. From day one, I noticed his garden. Not because it was beautiful. It wasn't. The soil looked constantly overturned, fresh and dark, perpetually damp even during dry spells, like he was preparing to plant something that never quite took root. There were no flowers, no vegetables, no decorative stones or garden gnomes. Just 6 rectangular plots of earth, each one meticulously maintained. I remember thinking their measurements were oddly specific. What made it strange was his schedule. Most people garden during the day, take advantage of natural light, wear sun hats and knee pads. Mr. Henshaw worked his garden at night. I'm talking 2, 3 in the morning. I'd wake up to use the bathroom and see him out there, kneeling in the dirt under a single floodlight, his lips moving in constant rhythm. His shadow would stretch across the disturbed earth, like it was reaching for something buried underneath. I first thought he was praying, maybe reciting verses or meditations to help with insomnia. Then one night, around 2:27 a.m., I remember the exact time because I'd checked my phone, wondering if I should be concerned. I stood at my bedroom window longer than usual and realized he wasn't praying. He was having conversations, full conversations with the soil. His hands would gesture like he was explaining something important, pointing to different plots. Then he'd pause, tilting his head as if listening to a response, waiting for confirmation from whatever he believed was down there. The way his fingers would trace patterns in the dirt, almost lovingly, made my skin crawl. I mentioned it once to the mailman, trying to sound casual, like I was just making small talk about quirky neighbors. He gave me this look, the kind that said he knew something but wasn't going to say it, the kind that made me wish I hadn't asked. He just shrugged and said Mr. Henshaw had lived there for 15 years and kept to himself. Then he moved on to the next house faster than usual. 3 weeks passed. The whispering continued, became part of my routine almost, this unsettling background noise to my new life. I started closing my curtains at night, bought blackout shades, tried to pretend I couldn't see that floodlight clicking on at ungodly hours. But curiosity is a dangerous thing. It builds inside you like pressure, demanding release. One evening in late September, I couldn't take it anymore. I waited until I saw his floodlight click on around 1:30 a.m., Then I slipped out my back door wearing dark clothes and old sneakers that wouldn't make noise. I crept along the fence line that separated our yards, my heart hammering so hard I was sure he'd hear it. The closer I got, the clearer his voice became. He was saying names, repeating them like a chant, like a prayer, like he was calling roll in some twisted classroom. Darla, Jefferson, the Claytons, Jennifer, each name spoken with this weird mixture of affection and possession that made my stomach turn. I crouched behind an overgrown lilac bush and peered through the gaps in the wooden fence, splinters digging into my palms as I gripped the weathered boards. That's when I saw them. They first looked like garden sculptures, the kind you'd see at an estate sale or antique shop. Pale figures emerging from the soil at odd angles, caught mid-motion. But as my eyes adjusted to the harsh floodlight, I realized they weren't decorative. They were anatomically detailed, disturbingly so. Wax mannequins, buried up to their torsos or shoulders, positioned throughout the garden bed like they were clawing their way up from underground, desperate to escape whatever held them below. But it wasn't just that they were there. It was how specific they were. How personal. One had glasses, wire-rimmed, catching the light just like real lenses would. Another had a birthmark on its visible shoulder, the kind of detail you'd only notice if you'd studied someone intimately. A third wore a wedding ring embedded into the wax finger, the band slightly worn like it had been there for years. Mr. Henshaw was kneeling in front of one, stroking its waxy hair with trembling fingers, murmuring something about forgiveness, about patience, about how they'd understand soon enough. The mannequin's face held this expression of frozen terror, mouth slightly open, eyes wide, like it had been modeled after someone's last moment of fear. I stumbled backward, a twig snapping under my foot like a gunshot in the quiet night. His head whipped toward my direction, faster than someone his age should move. I pressed myself flat against the fence, barely breathing, tasting copper fear in my mouth as his floodlight swept across the yard. I could hear him standing, hear his joints cracking, hear his footsteps approaching my hiding spot. The waiting stretched on until my chest ached. Then the light returned to its original position, and I heard him resume his whispering, though now it sounded different. Excited, like he knew I'd been there, like he was pleased I'd finally seen his work. I didn't sleep. I spent the entire night searching online for information about my house, the previous tenants, any history that might explain what I'd witnessed. The property records were sparse, but I found something that made my blood run cold. 6 different tenants in the past 12 years. None of them stayed longer than 8 months. Most of them women living alone, just like me. I found one of them on Facebook after 2 hours of searching. A woman named Jennifer Draven, who'd lived there 2 years ago. I sent her a message, trying not to sound insane, keeping it vague. She responded within an hour, despite it being 4 a.m. Her message was 3 words: "Get out now." She called me 20 minutes later. Her voice shook as she described Mr. Henshaw's obsession with the tenants across the street. How he'd watch from his windows with binoculars. How he'd started leaving gifts on her porch, dead flowers, smooth stones, handwritten notes that were just a bit too familiar. How she'd once caught him standing in her backyard at dawn, just staring at her bedroom window, not moving, not blinking, for over 20 minutes. She'd moved out after finding drawings. Detailed sketches of her face, her body, her daily routines. They were slipped under her door, one every few days, each one more invasive than the last. I wanted to leave. I really did. But I'd signed a year lease and blown my savings on the deposit, first and last month plus security. I convinced myself I could avoid him. Keep my head down. 6 more months and I'd be gone. I'd survive. Then the mannequins started moving. Not in some supernatural way. Someone was physically repositioning them, digging them up and reburying them elsewhere. I'd memorized their locations after that first night, watching from my window like it was my job, documenting which figure was where. The one with glasses had been near the back fence. 3 nights later, it was closer to the front, its wax fingers now pointed toward my house. Another week, and it was at the property line between our yards, close enough that I could see the individual eyelashes from my bedroom window. They were migrating toward my house, getting closer. I stopped going outside after dark, started parking in my garage instead of the driveway, even though it meant clearing out years of the previous owner's junk. I ordered groceries for delivery, paid the extra fees, tipped heavily to make sure drivers would keep coming. I installed additional locks on my doors, bought security cameras that I checked obsessively. But it didn't matter. Because one morning, 3 months after I first saw those things, I opened my front door to grab a package I'd been tracking, and froze. There on my porch, positioned perfectly upright against my doorframe, was a mannequin I'd never seen before. One that hadn't been in the garden. It was facing my door, its wax hand extended forward, palm up, as if offering to help me inside my own home. The detail was immaculate. The hair color matched perfectly. The height was exact. The small scar on the visible collarbone, the one I'd gotten from a childhood bike accident, was rendered in perfect miniature. It was modeled after Jennifer Draven, and tucked in its other hand was a Polaroid photograph of me, sleeping in my bed, taken from inside my house. From the foot of my bed, the angle suggested. Recent enough that I recognized the pajamas I'd worn just 2 nights ago. The police came. They took the mannequin, handled it with gloves like it was evidence in a murder case. They took the photograph, bagged it, documented everything. They questioned Mr. Henshaw for 6 hours in his living room, while I waited in a patrol car outside, watching through his windows. He never asked for a lawyer. Just sat there, smiling this calm smile, explaining how he made them as memorials for people who'd touched his life. The officer told me later it wasn't illegal to make sculptures. Even disturbing ones. Even ones that looked exactly like real people. Even ones that might have required extensive observation. They couldn't prove he'd been inside my house, as there were no signs of forced entry. The photo could have been taken with a zoom lens through my window, the detective suggested, though we both knew that wasn't true. We both knew what angle that shot required, what proximity. I moved out 3 days later. Broke my lease. Didn't care about the money anymore, didn't care about my security deposit or the penalty fees. I packed what I could fit in my car and left the rest. I never told anyone this, but there was something I found the morning before I left, something that still wakes me up gasping in the middle of the night. I'd gone into my basement to grab my storage boxes, things I'd shoved down there when I first moved in. I don't go down there often, the stairs are steep, the light is dim, and something about the space always felt wrong. The concrete floor was dusty, undisturbed, showing my footprints from months ago. Except for one corner, where the dust had been brushed away in a perfect circle, about 3 feet in diameter. And in the center of that circle were fresh soil deposits. The same dark, rich soil from Mr. Henshaw's garden, still slightly damp. When I pressed my hand against the concrete inside that circle, it felt slightly warm. Not hot, just warm. Like something underneath was generating heat. Like something was alive down there. I didn't investigate further. I just left. Sometimes, when I'm alone with my thoughts, my mind goes back to how it felt. About how far down a basement floor goes. About what might have been directly underneath my house during those 3 months I lived there. About whether one of those 6 plots in his garden had been designated for me. About whether he'd been preparing my space while I slept above it. After I moved out, I still drove past that neighborhood a couple of times, even though it's 2 hours out of my way. Couldn't help myself. I'd tell myself I'm just checking, just making sure. But the truth was darker than that. I was obsessed. I'd park down the street around 1 a.m., sit in my car with the lights off and watch. I did it more than 3 times. I discovered there's a new tenant in my old house. A young guy, maybe mid-20s. I saw him once during the day, taking out his trash, earbuds in, completely oblivious. The last time I was there in my car, watching, I saw Mr. Henshaw too, at 2 a.m. In his garden, kneeling in the dirt, floodlight casting his shadow across 7 plots now instead of 6. Adding a fresh mannequin to his collection of people who'd lived across the street. The new one had a beard, just like the guy living in my old house. I wanted to warn him, wanted to call the police again, do something. But what would I say? That my former neighbor makes creepy sculptures? That he whispers to his garden? They'd already told me none of it was illegal. So I just went back to my car, waited till about 5 a.m. and drove away. I told Jennifer Draven about it, because we've kept in touch since our first contact. It wasn't even up to 3 weeks later that she sent me a message that came with no words. Just a photo attachment. When I opened it, my hands started shaking so badly I nearly dropped my phone. It was a picture of Mr. Henshaw's garden. Taken recently, judging by the snow on the ground. 8 plots now, all of them occupied. And in the corner of the photo, barely visible in the shadows beyond the floodlight's reach, was what looked like freshly turned earth. A 9th plot, still empty, still waiting. I haven't responded to her message. Haven't blocked her either. Because every few days, she sends another photo. Same garden, same plots. But that 9th space keeps getting bigger, wider, like he's preparing for something that requires more room than the others. If you're watching or hearing this right now, you probably know what it's like to have a bad neighbor. Maybe they're loud. Maybe they park in your spot. But my creepy neighbor experience goes way beyond annoying, into something that still makes me check my locks multiple times before bed. 2 years ago, I moved into a small apartment complex in Wisconsin. Unit 4B, 2nd floor. The kind of place where you could hear conversations through the walls if someone talked loud enough. My neighbor in 4C was a guy named Derek Pullman. Mid-40s. Always wore these perfectly pressed khakis and polo shirts like he was heading to some office job, but I never saw him leave for work. Not once. He'd just be there, standing in his doorway sometimes when I got home, smiling, asking how my day went. The first time I called the police was in late September. It was 2 in the morning, and something heavy kept slamming against our shared wall, over and over, like stacked books or shoe boxes being dragged and dropped. I waited 30 minutes before I finally called. The dispatcher answered, and I gave my address. Before I could explain what was happening, she said my name. My full name, Catherine Hayes, Unit 4B. I remember pausing. I hadn't told her my name yet. She explained that my information pulled up automatically with the address. Made sense. I reported the noise and tried to go back to sleep. 2 officers showed up 20 minutes later. I heard them knocking on Derek's door. Heard his voice, calm, apologetic, explaining that he'd been rearranging some storage boxes and lost track of time. So sorry for the disturbance. It won't happen again, officers. They never knocked on my door to follow up. The banging stopped after that, for a while. 3 weeks later, I called again. This time it was music. Not loud music, but the same song playing on repeat from his apartment. A children's lullaby. The kind that sounds sweet during the day, but takes on this hollow, wrong quality at 3 in the morning. It played for 6 hours straight. When I called, the same dispatcher answered. She said my name again before I spoke. Catherine Hayes, Unit 4B. Her tone was different this time. A little slower, like she was making a note of something. I explained about the music. She said officers would do a welfare check. I watched through my peephole when they arrived. Derek opened his door immediately, like he'd been waiting. I couldn't hear what he said, but I saw one officer nod. Saw the other one glance down the hallway toward my door. They left 5 minutes later. The music stopped. But the next morning, there was a note slipped under my door. Handwritten. It said, I explained to the officers that you've been under a lot of stress lately. I hope you feel better soon, Catherine. Your neighbor, Derek. I never told him I was stressed. I barely spoke to him. That's when these creepy neighbor encounters started getting worse. Small things at first. My Amazon packages would be moved from my doorstep to right in front of my door, like someone wanted me to trip over them. The hallway light outside my apartment would be unscrewed every few days. Just mine. Just that one bulb. I called the police 5 more times over the next 2 months. Once for footsteps outside my door at 4 in the morning. That stopped the second I looked through the peephole. Once for what sounded like scratching on our shared wall. Twice for the smell of gas that I swore was coming from his apartment. Each time, the dispatcher knew my name immediately. Each time, the officers showed up, talked to Derek, and left. I never saw them knock on my door anymore. By December, I started noticing the way the dispatcher's voice changed when I called. Slower. More patient. The way you talk to someone you're managing. She started asking questions like whether I'd been taking my medication. Whether I had family in the area who could check on me. I didn't take medication. I told her that. She just said okay, Catherine, and sent officers anyway. One morning in early January, I found Derek in the hallway talking to Mrs. Blanc from 4A. When he saw me, he smiled and said something I couldn't quite hear. Mrs. Blanc looked at me the way you look at someone you pity. That's when I realized what he'd been doing. Every noise I reported, he'd already called about first. Reported me. Told them I was making the disturbances. Told them I was unstable. Told them I'd been harassing him with false complaints for months. He'd been building a file. Making sure that when I called, they already had a story about who I was. I stopped calling after that. Stopped reporting anything. What was the point? Then 2 weeks later, something actually happened. I came home from work and my apartment door was open. Not unlocked. Open. Wide open. I knew I'd locked it that morning. I always locked it. I stood in the hallway, and I could hear someone moving inside. Drawers opening. Footsteps. I ran to the stairwell and called 911. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely hold the phone. The dispatcher answered. Catherine Hayes, Unit 4B, she said, and I could hear it in her voice. That patience. That management. Someone's in my apartment, I said. Right now. Please send someone. There was a pause. Then she asked if I'd been drinking. Asked if I'd taken anything. Asked if I'd had another episode. I wasn't having an episode. Someone was in my apartment. I could still hear them. She said officers were on the way. She said to stay calm. I waited in the stairwell. 10 minutes. 15. When the officers finally arrived, they went to my apartment first. The door was closed now. Locked. Then they went to Derek's. I could hear him through the door. That calm voice. Explaining how I'd been doing this for months. How I'd call them about made-up emergencies. How he was worried about me. How I needed help. I came out of the stairwell. Tried to explain. Tried to tell them someone had been inside. One officer held up his hand. The other one was already writing something down. Ma'am, he said, we need you to go back inside your apartment. But someone was in there, I said. They asked if I had proof. Cameras. Witnesses. Anything missing. I went inside. Nothing was missing. But everything felt wrong. Like someone had touched everything and put it back just slightly off. The officers said they were leaving. Told me they'd be back if I called again tonight. said it in a way that didn't sound like a promise. And that's when I locked myself in my bathroom with my phone. I could hear Derek outside my apartment door, talking to the officers, explaining my behavior, explaining why I was unreliable, why I was the problem. I listened to them believe him, listened to them leave, and I stayed locked in there because I could hear someone breathing on the other side of the bathroom door. The breathing stopped around dawn. I stayed in that bathroom for 6 hours, sitting in the tub with a kitchen knife I'd grabbed on my way in. When I finally opened the door, my apartment was empty, but my laptop was open on the coffee table. I never left it open. The screen showed my building's tenant portal, my complaint history, 11 noise complaints filed, all under Derek's name. All about me, dating back to the exact week I moved in. I took screenshots, packed a bag, drove to my sister's place 3 hours away without telling anyone. For 2 weeks, I heard nothing. Then my landlord called, said Derek had expressed concern, said I'd abandoned the apartment without notice, said they needed to enter the unit for a welfare check. I told him I was fine. I told him about Derek, about the complaints and the setup. There was a long pause. Then he said Derek Pullman had moved out 3 days earlier, paid his lease termination fee, and left no forwarding address. I asked him to check the tenant records, to see when Derek filed those complaints. Another pause. Then he said there was no Derek Pullman in the system. Unit 4C had been vacant for 8 months, undergoing renovation after the previous tenant made complaints about structural damage. I hung up, pulled up those screenshots on my phone. Every single one had corrupted, just gray static. I never went back to that apartment, paid the fees to break my lease over the phone, had movers pack everything without me there. They said Unit 4C's door was open when they arrived. The apartment completely empty except for one thing. A stack of papers on the floor. Printouts of several 911 calls, which I figured were the ones I'd made, with handwritten notes in the margins. My sister asked me a few months later why I'd kept all the lights on at her place, why I wouldn't answer the door anymore. I didn't tell her what the movers found in that stack of papers. Notes about my work schedule, my sister's address, photos of her building, or that when I finally went through my phone's call history from that last night, the 911 call I made from the stairwell, it never went through. The line had been busy for 6 minutes straight. Someone else had been calling from inside my apartment the entire time. If these stories are creeping you out, subscribe. The horror isn't over. I need to tell you about Margaret DeBella. Not because I want to, but because what she did to me over those 9 months in 2019 needs to be documented somewhere. This is one of those real creepy neighbor stories that sounds impossible until it happens to you. She moved into the duplex next to mine in March. Early 50s. Impeccable posture. The kind of smile that belonged on a realtor's billboard. She brought over homemade cookies on day 3. Perfectly uniform, wrapped in cellophane with a ribbon that had clearly been measured. I should have noticed then how the ribbon was exactly 3 inches, how she held eye contact for exactly 4 seconds before blinking. But I was just grateful to have a quiet neighbor after the last tenant's nightly drum sessions. The first incident happened in May. My car was keyed. Deep gouges along the passenger side that spelled nothing, meant nothing, just random destruction. I filed a police report. Margaret came over that evening with chamomile tea and concern that felt rehearsed. She'd seen a teenager in a red hoodie near my car around 3 p.m. Very detailed description. Very helpful. The police found the kid 2 days later. He had an alibi. He'd been in school. I apologized to Margaret for the neighborhood trouble. She patted my hand with fingers that were somehow cold despite the summer heat building outside. The second incident was my garden. I'd spent 6 weekends building raised beds in my tiny backyard. Tomatoes, basil, flowers my grandmother used to grow. I'd come home from work to find them trampled, not randomly but methodically. Each plant crushed at the stem. Margaret's security camera faced my backyard. She showed me the footage. An opossum, she said. See how it moved. But the timestamp showed 2:47 p.m. Possums don't forage in broad daylight in June. I wanted to say something but stopped myself because her expression hadn't changed at all. By July, my mail was going missing. Not every day. Just enough to matter. A credit card statement. My car registration renewal. The notice for jury duty that I never received, which turned into a bench warrant that took 3 weeks to clear up. Margaret helped me fill out Postal Service complaint forms at her dining room table. Her handwriting had no variation. Every letter identical to the last. The worst part about true horror stories isn't the big moments. It's the small ones that make you question your own mind. My packages started arriving opened. Not torn, carefully unsealed and retaped. Nothing ever missing. When I mentioned it to Margaret, she suggested I might be forgetting I'd already opened them. Stress does that, she said. Makes you forgetful. I wasn't forgetful, but her voice was so steady, so reasonable. August brought the noise complaints. I received 3 citations for loud music after 10 p.m. I didn't own a stereo. I barely watched television. The police had recordings though, Margaret's recordings, of heavy bass coming through the shared wall at 10:23 p.m., 10:48 p.m., 11:04 p.m. I was in bed reading each of those nights, but I couldn't prove that. The officer suggested maybe my electronics were malfunctioning. Maybe I should be more considerate. Maybe I should keep it down. I started sleeping with my phone recording video of my silent apartment. Every night. 8 hours of nothing but me reading or sleeping in complete quiet. But who was I going to show it to? Who would watch 8 hours of footage to prove a negative? September was when I finally broke. I found her in my backyard at dawn, just standing there, motionless, staring at the fence between our properties. I yelled at her, actually yelled, called her insane, told her I knew what she was doing, that she was harassing me, that I was going to file a restraining order. She didn't react, didn't move, just slowly turned her head, not her body, just her head, and looked at me with those billboard eyes. Then she pulled out her phone and started recording. I was still screaming. She was completely calm. When I finally stopped, breathing hard and shaking with rage, she stopped recording, put her phone away, walked back to her side of the property line. The next 3 days, I had a court summons. Harassment, threatening behavior. She had 6 months of documentation. Every time I'd looked at her wrong. Every time I'd walked past her house too slowly. Every conversation recorded and time-stamped. And she had that video. Me screaming. Unhinged. Threatening. My lawyer told me to accept the no-contact order. It was either that or risk an actual trial with her evidence against my... What? My feeling that something was wrong? I stopped talking to my other neighbors after that. They'd already decided. The woman who screamed at poor Margaret, who couldn't handle a little constructive criticism about noise levels, who was clearly unstable. I built my case in silence, documented everything with the same precision she'd used against me. Time-stamped photos, videos, a spreadsheet tracking every incident. But I never filed it, because I finally understood what she'd taught me. The person who stays calm wins. The person who reacts loses. The person who can prove their emotions are under control gets believed. I was still compiling evidence in October when I found the first camera. It was in my air vent, professional grade, pointed at my bed. I pulled the vent cover completely off with shaking hands. Found one more in the kitchen, both recording to somewhere I couldn't trace. I should have called the police immediately. Instead, I stood in my living room holding 2 illegal surveillance devices and realized I had no proof of who'd installed them. My landlord had the keys. The maintenance crew had the keys. And Margaret had somehow convinced my landlord last month that she should have an emergency key to my unit. In case of fire. In case I needed help. He'd given it to her because she was so responsible. So trustworthy. I was still standing there when my phone buzzed. It was a photo of me in my living room, holding the cameras, taken from outside my window. The next message was an address I didn't recognize. Then another text. We should talk about your installation of recording devices in your own home. Seems like concerning behavior. See you tomorrow at 7 a.m. Don't be late. I looked toward Margaret's house. Every light was off, but I knew she was watching. And tomorrow she was going to show me what happened to people who tried to gather evidence against her. I didn't go to that address. Instead, I called my brother in Phoenix. Told him I was visiting for a while. Maybe permanently. I packed one suitcase. Left everything else. My landlord seemed relieved. Margaret had already told him I was becoming unstable. Paranoid. He'd actually thanked her for her patience with me. I drove away at 4 a.m., 3 hours before our scheduled meeting. In my rearview mirror, I saw Margaret standing in her doorway, watching, not moving to stop me, just watching. I never went back, never filed charges. My documented evidence sits in a cloud storage folder I haven't opened since, till this day. Because I finally understood that Margaret didn't want to destroy me. She wanted to study me, to see how long it would take, how much someone could endure before they either broke completely or disappeared. I chose to disappear. Sometimes I wonder about whoever moved into my old place. If Margaret brought them cookies tied with precisely 3 inches of ribbon. If they noticed how she never blinks at irregular intervals. I hope they're smarter than I was. I hope they leave sooner. A while after I settled at my brother's place, I got a Facebook friend request. No profile picture. No mutual friends. The account was created the same day it contacted me. The name was just 2 words, still watching. I deleted Facebook. Changed my number again. Started researching how difficult it actually is to disappear completely in America. Because the thing about psychological horror isn't that it ends when you escape. It's that you never really know if you escaped at all. I moved again after that month. Somewhere smaller. Somewhere I could see all the neighbors from my window. Somewhere Margaret DeBella hopefully doesn't know about. If you made it to the end, subscribe and turn on notifications. Some stories only find the people who are still here.